IVM.
This is Storytellers and Storysellers live on tape. You're listening to Vineet Kanabar on the IVM Podcast Network. Now, I've spoken to a fair few musicians or people from the music business on this show as we near episode 150. It is surprising to me. Well, it is surprising to me, and I don't know if it's surprising to you, that I've never had someone from the classical music arts on this show before. Shastriya Sangeet has never seen or has never been properly represented on my show. And today's the day where we change all that. Today is the day where we rectify this. Please join me in extending a storyteller's welcome to Purbayan Chatterjee.
Thank you for having me to join the show.
Love it, love it. I'm so glad that we're doing this. I'm so glad to have you. Let me do a quick introduction before we go into our customary money-making break. Purbayan Chatterjee is one of the topmost sitar maestros of the world. It feels so good, right? Sitting across someone who's among the best in the world at something. I've had people who are the best at beatboxing in the world. I've had people who are the best at singing. And now having someone who's among the best at sitar. He belongs to the Senia Malhar Gharana, founded by Baba Alauddin Khan. He's a recipient of the Indian President's Award, the Aditya Vikram Birla Award, the Rotary International Award, many other prestigious awards. His music is inspired by the sound of Pandit Nikhil Banerjee, and his music combines the tone and richness of Pandit Banerjee's style and a contemporary touch of his own urbane sensitivity. So nicely written, right? Very nicely written.
I wrote it myself.
Yeah, you did. That's a welcome change
Even
as well.
if I must say so myself, but I wrote it myself. This was many years ago.
And that's a welcome change, right? It's not like some PR hack. Not that we don't like PR hacks. We love you, PR hacks. But it comes through when an artist writes it himself, right? He conceptualized the groundbreaking project Shastriya Syndicate, which was the first Indian classical band, and then very recently put together during the pandemic virtual musicians concert, which was a no latency thing, right? I will get into talking more about that as well. There is so much to unpack, Prabhanda, from your bio. I'm very excited for our episode. But before that, like I said, we need to make a little bit of money from podcasting. So we'll go into a short break. Back after Purbayan Chatterjee, after these messages on Storytellers and Storysellers. This is Vineet Kanabar. Go nowhere. And we're back. We're kicking off the episode in earnest. Purbayan, let me get you in by asking you something that's always been on my mind, right? What is the difference between a sitar and a veena?
Okay, so historically speaking, Veena was the instrument played by Mian Tansen,
Right.
who is the father of all Indian music.
Sure.
Because he brought a lot of the knowledge of raga music,
Mhm.
which was noted down in the Vedas, in the Gandharva Veda, as well as in the Atharva Veda.
Mhm.
Mian Tansen was the court musician in King Akbar's court. And it is from that time onwards that we have the recorded history of our music. Of course, we have Baiju Baura also.
Of course.
But he was a beenkar, and he used to play the veena, which is an instrument which is described in history as a neck with some frets on it.
Mhm.
And then there are two sort of sound boxes which are either made of metal or sometimes made from gourd.
Gourds, yeah.
And so this was the traditional Indian instrument. This kind of bifurcated into the Vichitra Veena and the Rudra Veena.
Right.
And some played the Vichitra Veena. It was mainly a difference in sitting posture when you played these two kinds of Veenas. Some were played more or less sort of horizontal, just put on the stage in front of you, and some were held up a little bit, not like the sitar, but held at an angle of maybe 20-30 degrees.
Sure.
Now, the interesting part of it is that our musical culture is so keenly involved or associated with our history.
Mhm.
So when we had the Mughals come into our country, we had scholars like Amir Khusro, and the whole Sufi and Bhakti movement started.
Right.
So, and we often talk about Emperor Akbar's, mixing of religions. He invented a religion called Din-i-Ilahi.
Of course.
But, what is of paramount importance is how two or more cultures became one homogeneous mix. We have the language Urdu, which is Arabic and Persian and Hindi,
Hindi,
from the
Hindustani,
Devanagari script to the Urdu script, but it is predominantly Hindi. And Urdu has, anyway, that's a different subject, but Urdu has so much of Hindu literature on it. There are whole verses in praise of goddess Durga. It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, these people, these great scholars like Amir Khusru, and there's a little debate about whether it was Amir Khusru or there was Khusru Khan. There were two different people with about 70 or 80 years or 100 years between them.
Right.
But you know how history is. Once you're 1,000 years down the line, 100 years down,
it all blurs into each other.
It all blurs into each other. So they brought in the Persian Sitar, which is a very basic 2 or 3 string instrument. Could have been for 2 or 3 different reasons, is because that they wanted to bring in the lyrical quality of the music from the Middle East, from Persia mostly, and to perform the kind of Sufi kind of songs that were coming, and also the imaginative and lyrical content could not be played so easily in the form which was Drupad, which was played on the Veena.
Sure.
So these two instruments sort of fused and merged to create this instrument called the sitar, which has since then undergone many modifications and become what it is today.
Love it. How did your tryst with the sitar start?
So I was all of 3.5 years old when my dad started initiating me into vocal music. I learned how to sing Saregama. I didn't want to sit in one place like with any other 3.5-year-old. And then when I was 5 years old, my dad took me on his tour of Europe. He'd gone to perform in Europe. And I think it was in Switzerland, and I was being a very naughty kid. And he handed me a sitar which belonged to the son of a student of his.
Right.
A Swiss student of his had gotten this, like, it wasn't really a baby sitar, but a smaller size sitar.
Sure.
So I was given this instrument to quieten me down. I don't know if that worked, but I started playing the sitar.
Right.
And then we were touring for about 2.5 months. When I came back to India, I was straight away given a full-size sitar.
Right.
I don't know, my dad was a taskmaster, and he didn't believe in shortcuts. So he said, I'm going to give you a full-size sitar, you better get used to it.
Love it.
And
do you have any of those 2 sitars still?
I do not, unfortunately. The small one didn't belong to me fairly.
Right.
I mean, in all fairness, when I was in Switzerland. The second one, which was my first full-size sitar, was given away to a student of my dad's, another student of my dad's, when I moved on to my next full-size sitar, which I do have now.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
Which I've had for the last 30 odd years.
That's amazing. Feels like a companion that you've kept with you for the longest time. That's beautiful. And I love the fact that the one that you used or started out with has been paid forward to someone else, and they're figuring it out.
Well, I in this context, I can tell you of an interesting anecdote, a joke, which Ustad Ali Akbar Khan Sahab, my guru and my dad's guru, he made this joke. Somebody asked him, how old is your sarod? So he said, this is about 70 years old.
Right.
And he was not 70 years old at the time. And he said, so this was made by my uncle. It was passed down to me. It was, like, he said, I have not changed this sarod. I've changed my wife, but I've not changed the sarod.
Oh, wow. Wow. You have to be a certain stature in life to say that and get away with it.
Indeed. But he was Ali Akbar Khan Sahab.
Of course.
He is Ali Akbar Khan Sahab.
Of course. Purbayan, let me ask you this. And again, such a rich career and such a rich legacy of music that you come from. You're also a global ambassador of music. What does that mean? And what does that entail in how you embody and take the traditions of music forward?
Well, we are all aspiring towards the role of being a global ambassador. To call myself a global ambassador would be a little pompous, I think, but we're all aspiring towards it. There are people like Pandit Ravi Shankar and Ustad Zakir Hussain who have led by example.
Sure.
And they have shown us what it takes to stand for your art form and for your musical culture or for your artistic culture. I think, to put it in a nutshell, to become an ambassador for anything, you require a well-rounded view of the things that are outside of the scope of what you do.
Right.
So, for instance, I am a sitar player. I am an Indian classical sitar player. The only way I'll be able to call myself an ambassador for this art form is if I have well-rounded knowledge about other musical cultures, other musical instruments, other musical art forms and how I am able to relate my own art form to those art forms.
Beautiful.
I think without that kind of a sense of empathy almost towards other musical cultures, you cannot build the desired bridges that it takes for yourself to become because what is an ambassador? At the end of the day, it's somebody who can get the word out.
Right.
Somebody who can talk somebody else's language and say, look, this is what you do, this is what I do. And so we are aspiring towards that role. It calls for a lot of different things. For one, it calls for good articulation, but it also calls for great potency of thought.
Right.
You need to know what it is that you're trying to put out there. So we're all aspiring towards that.
I love the cogency with which you explained that entire thing. I think that can just be taken up and implanted into so many different disciplines and still hold true. I loved it. Let me further that question and ask you, in 2023 or in the third decade of the 21st century, I mean, let's not be as temporal as just 2023, how has the perception of Indian classical music around the world evolved? Now, late 50s, early 60s, I think that's when the Western consciousness opened in Indian music. Right? People started discovering around that time. And then you had, influences being pollinated. And I think it was around the 70s when we really took the stage in a big way, right? And of course, the doyens that you mentioned are held in such exalted status. But how is the art itself looked at today? And what are some surprising facts that you've discovered in your journey taking this art to the world?
So, if you study the history of music in human civilization, you will see that we have progressed in a linear fashion positively.
Sure.
We have, with every generation, we have more awareness, we have more talent, we have more of an ability to draw straight lines between one art form and the other. Having said that, every art form has had its crests and troughs.
Right.
Okay. If you look at Western classical music, for instance, okay. Now, Western classical music refers to a period of time. Music that was made in a certain period of time. In the West, you have the Baroque period, you have the classical period, you have the Renaissance period. In India, when we talk about classical music, when we say classical music, now, first of all, I think we need better education about what is classical music and what is folk music. I mean, we generally classify anything that is time-honored as classical.
Right.
Which is kind of not wrong also, but
Sure.
which is not necessarily the right way of looking at things. We have our classical traditions, Drupad, and then Khayal, but then there's probably 500 years between them, and it is linked to history. And with not enough academic study or historical study has gone into it for the common man
Sure.
to know and be proud of where we are today in terms of our musical lineage, in terms of our musical history. If the right amount of effort would have been made by our education system, by the powers that be. And I'm not talking about today. I'm talking about, India as a country or even pre-independence. If we had taken the right kind of effort, we would have had the same knowledge about our classical music as a Western conservatory of music has about their classical music, about, exactly which period in time they had a composer like a Bach or a Beethoven or Chopin or a Tchaikovsky, and how jazz, how, in New Orleans from the Conservation Hall, how jazz music came into, we do not have, this kind of information.
Right.
Despite that, if you are to look at the source, the fodder of all music in India, all music, any music, whether it is Bollywood, whether it is commercial forms of music, which may be non-Bollywood, whether it is, as we call it now, independent music, as we call it, or indie music, as it's called, or any other form of music, the fodder and the source is either classical or folk. If it's Indian. Unless you're borrowing from a Western genre, you could be borrowing from hip-hop. Or you could be borrowing from a Philharmonic Symphony. I'm talking about two ends of the spectrum. Or you could be borrowing from so many sources. There's dubstep, there's so many other soundscapes. But essentially, what is it that is Indian? Why is a composer who's composing for Bollywood making music for an Indian film?
Right.
Because you're bringing something Indian to it. Maybe you're building a bridge with another Western art form. That fodder is classical. That fodder is either classical or folk. Therefore, any form, whether it is Sufi, whether it is Qawwali, whether it is ghazal, is all stemming from a classical art form. I think that awareness has not been there. And if anything, that awareness is slowly creeping in.
Right.
Because people have the internet today, people have YouTube, and if they listen to Kajrare today, they can then at least they know that this is a particular genre. I mean, Sufi or Qawwali or whatever genre, whichever song is. I mentioned Kajrare because it was at one time it was playing in so many clubs across the world. But people have that knowledge and that information. What they do with it is entirely dependent on them. Now, here is where I feel that when you mentioned the 60s and the 70s were great, because, this is the time when the West sort of woke up to the realization that the music made in the Indian subcontinent had great emotional depth and had great intellectual power.
Right.
So, and melodically speaking, and it appealed to them enough that there were so many seekers, people like George Harrison, Yudi Menuhin, they came to India seeking that melodic complexity and this richness. Unfortunately, as a people, we tend to be not so proud of because we've not been taught to be proud of our own. This is too much ingrained in our DNA. We cannot pin this blame on anybody. You can't pin this blame on the government. You can't pin this blame on some other government. You can't pin this. This is just hundreds and thousands of years of being invaded by one entity, bringing in one culture. We've lost a sense of pride in our own. And if there's any service that anybody can do, and I think the media stands in the most powerful role to play, including movies. I mean, the movies are one of the most potent forms. If somebody really wanted to do service to a sense of Indian national identity, then you would go out and ask us to be proud of this kind of... I'm not only talking about the music. You can do for the music what you've done for yoga, for instance, which is now honored, respected, loved the world over. So is our music.
Right.
But I think more needs to be done in terms of people in India, younger people thinking that this is cool, thinking that this is... Because it really is cool.
It is.
Yeah, it really is cool. And if you have the stomach for it, if you're going to delve into it, you will find out that it inspires so much in you.
It most definitely does. I mean, I have had, in my experience with Indian classical music purely as a listener, I've had periods where I have completely disengaged with it. I was exposed to it because of, Bengali family, automatically sort of extends.
Same as me.
Extends in, right? But then you have your teenage period where you're like, no, everything's, Nirvana and the school that follows from there. And then you discover electronic music and then the school that follows there. And of late, I've found myself coming back to the richness of Indian instrumental music. I'm not saying classical only, because I found that there's depth in folk, there is depth in amalgamation, what people are doing with different streams of music combining. What I find so rich and interesting is the fact that there is something for every moment and mood and thought process within this ecosystem, right? And I find that, again, hard to navigate sometimes. And I think that speaks to your point when you say, maybe there is a little bit that we need to do. Definitely there's something that we need to do here to curate this better, to make it more accessible, to provide a platform for appreciation. The same way you would provide a platform for appreciation of rock music, for example, right? Without the mythology of grunge, there is no grunge.
Well, if I may cut you short there,
sure.
It is not even to provide a platform for appreciation, because that in itself sounds like, it sounds a little patronizing, for want of a lack of a better phrase. It sounds like it needs, it's just people's perception of, for instance, rock music. If you put on a cowboy hat and, if you have a nice leather jacket and if you have a guitar in your hand, that's a teenager's perception of being cool.
Sure.
Whereas, as opposed to that, wearing a dhoti and a kurta and sitting down with a harmonium is probably not that cool in a teenager's perception, right?
Sure.
And yet, the best, the topmost, I mean, if you talk about the Eagles, okay, if you talk about the Beatles,
Sure.
they have come here seeking our music, obviously, because they thought it was cool. Now, that is the point that was driven home in the 70s so effectively by people like Pandit Ravi Shankar, Ustad Zakir Hussain. He's shown the world that we are cool.
Right.
And somebody needs to sort of carry on that work and show, I mean, because you know, the audience at large do not need to be bombarded with a lot of information. They do not need to be told that, oh, it comes from the Vedas. I mean, that information is good. Great. If somebody wants to seek that out, they'll seek it out. I feel that perception has to be created. It's a very subtle, it's a branding, it's a exercise in branding.
Definitely.
Which can be done by the movies, which can be done by associating this with popular sports like cricket, like football.
Sure.
In Europe was married to operatic music.
Right.
The theme songs for Manchester United, a lot of the European teams, AC Milan, were done with operatic sounds.
Sure.
So maybe something like that.
Even now, the Champions League theme song is
there you go.
An opera, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but we're not doing that for our classical music. We have the theme song of IPL. I mean, we'll try to ape a Shakira, you know, doing her Rula La La or whatever. I mean, she did that theme song for the World Cup, FIFA World Cup, and whatever we do for our IPL. I mean, we are trying to imitate all that, and it's just the loss is just ours.
Fascinating conversation with Purbayan Chatterjee. We're going to go into another break. On the other side, we'll talk a little bit more about the stuff he's been doing and what hope there is for us to fix some of the things that we just talked about. Go nowhere. This is Storytellers and Storysellers, and we'll be back after these messages. And we're back. We're talking to Purbayan Chatterjee about the place for Indian classical music in the world and in India. Purbayan, before we went into the break, you were talking about the sort of rebranding that Indian classical music needs to appeal to fans in India specifically, right? I think around the world we have great branding. I want to ask you a little bit more about stuff that you've been doing in this regard as well, right? I know you have a foundation. I know you perform regularly as well. What do you see in the current state as things are today, right? What do you see specifically that you think should evolve or change? Like, are we creating a great experience for people? Are we able to amalgamate other things that we're bringing in together? For example, the Shakti concert that happened recently, last concert, sold out. People wanted to go. People loved it. It was all over social media. Now, was that because it was Shakti and I was there?
It was a magical experience.
I'm sure it was, right? I missed it. I'm going to curse myself for the rest of my life for missing it. But why did that work versus some of the other stuff that doesn't catch fire like that?
Well, as you correctly said, that worked because it was Shakti.
Right.
And those guys have done something right for a few decades now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is exactly what I was talking about. Here we have John McLaughlin, who is a seeker.
Mm-hmm.
And he has come to our country seeking our music, specifically Carnatic music. And he has gone down that path through the eyes of one of the greatest ever, Ustad Zakir Hussain.
Of course.
And therefore, they can create music which is relatable.
Right.
But it's not diluted to be made relatable.
Right.
It is just relatable because good music is relatable.
For sure.
You do not need to make music, a certain kind of music for a certain kind of people. You need to make the best music that you can yourself. You can just look inward and try to express yourself in the best possible way. It's that simple.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have the freedom to do that and the belief in yourself that you can, then you'll produce fantastic, like magical results. But coming back to what you were saying earlier, the onus is also on us as musicians.
Right.
Or the people who present our music. For instance, I find in a lot of Indian classical concerts, there are long speeches, both by the presenters and the artists. And there's a lot of, saying things like, oh, forgive my mistakes. I mean, it's almost like putting it into the audience's head that you're going to make. Yes, humility is great.
Sure.
But, I mean, you don't necessarily have to make a big show of it. You can just, and people like Ustad Zakir Hussain or people like John McLaughlin, because they belong to both worlds. In Zakir Bhai, because he belongs equally to the West, they know what it takes to be able to communicate with this generation. They've done it for, it's amazing because they've communicated with generation after generation, and they're still relevant because they have shed some of the things which tradition is great. Tradition is like inherited property. It's passed down to you, but then what you do with it is also important. If you just preserve it as it was in its original form, you may not be doing a great service to tradition.
Sure.
You must add your 2 cents to
Absolutely.
it. So I feel the onus is also on us to make, to sort of look inward and see why, if it's a more commercial form of music, why is it working?
Sure.
Why do we have, as you said, a rock concert working so well in India, which has such a strong musical culture? Perhaps because you have great production, perhaps because you have great lighting, perhaps because you have great sound. You don't have, feedback in the middle of the concert. You don't have the rock artist saying, I need more monitors. You don't have that.
We do. We have that all the time.
Yes, but what I mean is if you're in a professional outfit, perhaps, if you look at the successful outfits, they will take time. You don't have a rock band saying, we don't need a sound check. We can be done in 10 minutes.
No.
Exactly. So those are things we need to look inward. We need to look at ourselves. Somebody needs to put the mirror on us. Yeah. We don't have, I'm not just talking about rock. I'm talking about the other genres that work. Work as in commercially work.
Right.
That can sell out an auditorium. If you have a professional outfit, they're not going to be proud of the fact that they didn't rehearse. I often hear classical musicians saying, we are making it up on the spot, which is a basic tenet of improvised music.
Sure.
Of course, you're making it up on the spot, but you rehearse making it up on the spot.
Right.
Jazz musicians, if they have a gig coming up, they will rehearse for a couple of weeks for one gig.
Yeah.
If they have a tour coming up, I had the good fortune and the privilege of hanging out and interacting with the great jazz legend Pat Metheny.
Right.
I hung out in his home in New York. And he had mentioned to me in those days that, if you want to audition for the Pat Metheny group, which is a legendary group, you'll have to come and rehearse with us for 4 months.
Wow.
For a tour that may last a month, you'll have to come and play with us for 4 months. Now, why are we so proud of the fact that we don't rehearse? A sitar player just meets a tabla player. And yes, great, we have a great musical tradition and we can just sit and make the music, but maybe we can make better music if we hang out with each other. Miles Davis used to call a bunch of musicians home and he would cook for them. And that's how it all started.
Right.
So sometimes it's not even about sitting down and playing music. It's about just getting that bonhomie with each other. So I feel that there are the things which we also need to do. But then there's that whole branding exercise which needs to be effectively performed. We need the help. We need leaders. We need good leaders. And then we need the help of the media and we need the help of the mainstream. It's interesting that we don't call our music mainstream.
It's very surprising.
Classical music is not mainstream.
Absolutely.
Whereas if you look at our musical culture, this is our mainstream.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's the background of how Bollywood has evolved. It's the background of how a lot of our musical traditions have evolved. And it's very surprising.
And of course, Bollywood is successful. They will be because they've taken the same content, which is our classical and our folk content, or ghazals or Sufi songs, and put it into good sounding, good quality recorded stuff, which is relatable with good visuals. Of course, it's going to work. You could do the same for classical music. It's going to work.
It should, absolutely. Let me ask you 2 things and 2 quick follow-ons to this conversation. And I know we've spent a lot of time talking about this, but it's a vital conversation, at least from where I'm sitting, that we're having here, right? 2 questions. One, what's the government doing? This is a government that has, currently speaking, and again, not to get too political about this, but it's a government that keeps talking about Hindu identity and Indianness and projecting it on the world stage in many different ways. What's the government doing about it?
So I think the intentions are in the right place. What I hear about Indian heritage, not necessarily Hindu, because, as I said, our music especially is the most secular music in the whole world.
Syncretic,
and I think that's recognized.
Yeah.
That is well recognized by the government because they have Urdu. There's a lot of emphasis on Urdu poetry.
Right.
There are whole festivals which are dedicated to Sufi music and which are promoted and supported by the Ministry of Culture.
Sure.
We have a very dynamic Minister of Culture, Mrs. Meenakshi, Honorary Minister of Culture, Mrs. Meenakshi Lekhi, and she's doing a wonderful job. But I think, as I said, the perceptions are too ingrained when they're talking about the identity of Indian music and Indian culture. That identity has become a very populist version of itself.
Right.
It's become there's too much emphasis on pop culture. There's too much emphasis on, so for instance, I see in a lot of these concerts, we have the G20 summit, and in the lead up to it, I mean, I also had the chance of performing, at an investors meet in Karnataka, myself with Kaushiki Chakravarti, with Aruna Sairamji. But there's a lot of tendency of putting the whole classical folk component of it as one package.
Right.
So you have in the main stage, so to speak, you'll have a big Bollywood act. Fine. But then why package Carnatic, Hindustani, folk, fusion, everything into that one slot?
Right.
And then present it we were lucky that we performed in the main stage. But there are so many young musicians who are so entertaining. I have performed at the Mood Indigo Festival of the IIT Bombay here, and we had a huge crowd of young people who were relating to our concert. We had the great Ranjit Barot on the drums with us. And you can create music which is highly entertaining. I have heard so many young, not only classical, but people like Mame Khan are, I think, doing a great job because he's the voice of folk music, Rajasthani folk music. But you need that Bollywood. Why do you only succeed when you have that Bollywood slot? You need that one song to hit. And even that is going now. I find that Bollywood is no longer, there's just too much happening in terms of Bollywood also. I don't see a song that endures, that becomes a big hit there. Okay, there are maybe one or two songs in the entire year.
I think it's only Arijit songs that make it like that.
So essentially that means that whether it's the government, because you mentioned the government, but who are the government? The government are us only. We have elected the government.
Sure.
So they are just a mirror of what our society is like. So if we are bringing in a whole populist culture, that means my neighbor next door, if I tell him that, hey, wo ek Ustad Rashid Khan ka concert hai, jayega tum? बोलेगा हाँ वो बड़ा उस्ताद है नहीं लेकिन हम लोग चलते हैं उधर to some Bollywood. I don't want to take a specific name because तो ये perception हो गया है. मतलब they may have the information and that person could be a cultured person. But as I said, there are two sides to every coin because you may be going to a classical concert and you have to endure an hour of speeches, people just garlanding each other and praising each other. So if I had to buy a ticket, I would go to an act where all of that is not there.
Sure.
So we've got to work on it from both sides.
I hope all curators who are listening to this are taking notes. Second follow-up to this, and it's interesting that you mentioned young people while you were answering my first one. There's a guy called Ali Sethi, right? My producer Jalasmi is just melting in her seat at the mention of Ali Sethi, right? Now, people know Ali Sethi because of Pasudi. Pasudi, the song that came out last year. It was among the top 5 songs on Spotify. Been listened to left, right and center. I think Jalasmi is searching for Pasudi now and she's going to tune out of this conversation and just listen to Pasudi for the rest of this recording. But Ali Sethi is a very interesting character. Young, expat Pakistani, trained deeply in the classical and folk traditions, right? He's been instrumental in conserving a few gharanas and their traditions. But he's also brought in different elements. My first exposure to Ali Sethi was on a hip-hop album by 2 other expat South Asian men, right? An act called the Sweatshop Boys with one Indian and a Pakistani guy, and Ali Sethi was featuring on it, right? What I love about this guy is he has all the sensibilities of what a great rock arrangement could be or a synth-driven arrangement could be, but he will take the elements from folk or classical and present it in a manner that is very appealing to young people. And not just appealing to young people in the sort of, oh, I like this, but appealing to young people that they keep coming back and he becomes an entry point for another generation into discovering their own tradition.
Indeed.
Right? My long-winded setup for this question is, are you seeing folks like this emerge in the Indian scene? Someone that you look at and say, hey, that's a bright spark that can bring the worlds together?
Well, I'm going to be a little self-centered and
please
steer this conversation towards what I'm trying to do.
Sure.
So I have this foundation called the Purbayan Art and Artist Foundation.
Right.
And as we were casually chatting, I told you, I felt the need for educating people not only in music, but educating them about the entertainment industry, about how to make yourself relatable, so in response to what you're saying, but also how would you make yourself relatable if you couldn't get your work out there? Right. So you've got to take a three-pronged approach, I feel. A, you have to find the right mode and medium, which the reality of it today is that digital is the most potent and it's an easily accessible medium.
Absolutely.
Then you have to make your content, whatever is your content, relatable and friendly towards that medium.
Right.
And then the third thing that you need to do is to make the right strategic choices and I'm putting these two things as one because it's related to one another, is be savvy and aware of the tools that are available at your disposal.
Sure.
So the foundation teaches people how to be digitally savvy, how to put your work out there, and to make your content crisp and entertaining. And I think that is the key. If you look at it, the answers are much simpler sometimes.
Right.
I mean, I had a sit down with Shantanu Moitro, who's a dear friend of mine, and, over breakfast. And he suddenly asked me, he says, you guys complain that classical music is less consumed. He used the word consumed, not only as a live art form, because it is better consumed as a live art form than digitally.
Sure.
So, okay. So it's very interesting. If you look at the analytics of it, you may be able to fill out a Shanmukhanand with a good classical artist, somebody who is a box office success. But if you look at the numbers on YouTube, you'll see that those numbers are abysmally low compared to a mid-level covers artist.
Sure.
Okay. Why is that the case? So he said, have you ever thought about simply the quality of recording? Classical music, when you're putting out on YouTube, have you ever thought about the fact that it is all poorly shot with a phone, much of the time by somebody sitting at the back of the audience, much of the time with a lot of chatter, so have you thought about all that? So this made me think that I really need to focus on all of these things. And luckily I have some very kind people with me in the foundation, and they have given us this wonderful space where we can, it's fully rigged, and it's a studio come sort of performance space. So we do our rehearsals there. We are very lucky that Ustad Zakir Hussain came and blessed the space. We did a rehearsal for the concert that I had a chance to do with him in the NCPA in Jamshed Bhava in January. But we also have classes there. And now we are starting performances. On the 7th of April, we have Rakesh Chaurasia in that little setting. And we make sure that we teach our students how to make a reel, which is 1 minute and 30 seconds. You play a raga within that time. I had started something called Glimpse of a Raga. And
that is fantastic. That is very sharp.
Yeah, it's a drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
Mind you, it's a drop in the ocean because, there has to be enough numbers of people populating the eco space with enough good content before it begins to take effect. But it's a start. And this is my vision, and I'm sure other people have had this vision. You have a lot of talented people who are trying to do the same thing in different ways and different forms. But as I said, it's going to take a while before it all kicks in, and we do need the help of the mainstream media and the film ecosystem. I think something like a Bandish Bandits, which merits mention, is great. It's great branding, and of course you had a lot of the purists cry horse, but then some, as Kishore Kumar said, kuch to log kahenge. But it's like I've had the opportunity of playing for the second season of Bandish Bandits also. I just and I think they're doing a good job. And interestingly enough, without giving much away, but there's a sitar player who's featuring.
Fantastic.
There somewhere, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm glad you answered my question in your own way, because I feel like instead of trying to find an equivalence, like who is the early city for India, I think you've given us a much more fertile answer in that sense, right? About what you are doing and what the space really needs. And I think it's phenomenal. Congratulations on that entire space. I know that it feels like it might be a drop in the ocean. But when the time is right for something, and I honestly feel, even before we set up this conversation, I felt like the thrust for Indian classical, from a packaging point of view, from an accessibility point of view, like you said, from a relatability point of view as well, is, I think the time is right now, because we have the right digital infrastructure in place. Audiences who have been in touch with this kind of music previously are in the right position to navigate, to help younger folks navigate through all of this. And I think there's a true resurgence in finding Indian content cool again.
Yeah. Well, I think your question merits a separate answer too.
For sure.
Albeit a short one. But I think when you mentioned Ali Sethi, see, I think what they do well, when I say they, I mean, like I've been listening to Coke Studio for a while, or similar platforms. And the one thing that sometimes you have to learn what not to do.
Sure.
It's what stands between good art and not so good art is often just ignorance about what not to do.
Sure.
And I feel I often see a lot of platforms here, and I see that there's a great deal of confusion about what is the story. They are really trying hard to be cool and bringing in a little rap. But then what somebody like Ali Sethi gets right is knowing what to mix with what, in what kind of, and make no mistake, we have that talent here.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, the brief that is handed down to them by people who are like marketing executives, who are unfortunately the powers that be, because they're paying for it, is a complete set of gibberish.
Right.
Yeah. And I have no qualms about saying this, because I have seen what happens when I go and play for ad jingles, and I see the music director fighting with somebody at the ad agency. And then I see there may be somebody in the ad agency with vision, but then the ad agency fights with somebody from the corporate who has a completely different vision of things, and which is often... So you have to let artists curate the music.
Love it.
And that's when you'll get this right.
That's a great bottom line. I'm going to pivot very quickly to talk about a project of yours that I'm very keen to discuss with you before I let you go. You launched something called Unbounded.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the thought behind it. You've had some phenomenal musicians play on it. Tell us more.
So the Unbounded was done all during COVID,
Right.
COVID times. And I was very lucky to have the support of this company called Sufi Score, which is a British company. A lot of people think that Unbounded was made just as a distance collaboration, where I wanted to sort of prove to the world that we could make music sitting in different, because we had done another thing called Live and In Sync, which
Right.
you briefly mentioned. Darshan Doshi, myself, Aditya Srinivasan, who is the pilot of this project,
Right.
and Mahesh Raghavan. Actually, Aditya and Mahesh are both whiz kids.
Right.
They are both Berkeley educated kids. And Aditya is a top grade sound engineer. In fact, he's been assisting the main engineers for the Shakti concerts also. And he's been doing a lot of work for Ustad Zakir Hussain Sahib. So we did this thing where we could figure out how to sort of work around latency. I wouldn't say get rid of latency, because you can't, but you can work around it and play together. And we did this with one musician sitting in Bangalore, one musician sitting, etc. Or somebody could be in California. But Unbounded wasn't that.
Right.
Unbounded for me was a vision I've had for a while. I wanted to make music which spoke to a lot of different people. And there were some great musicians across the world, like Antonio Sanchez, the drummer and the person who scored for Birdman. He's a multiple Grammy winner, and even, Birdman was in the contention for the Oscars.
Absolutely.
So Antonio Sanchez, people like...
I have a list here. Ustad Zakir Hussain, Bela Fleck, Antonio Sanchez, Thana Alexa, Michael League. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right.
Michael League is the front man of Snarky Puppy.
Oh, yeah, of course he is.
Multiple Grammy winner.
Yeah, fantastic.
He's
right?
the bass player, yeah.
Gary Husband, Jordan Rudess, Shankar Mahadevan, Javed Ali, Ustad Rashid Khan Saab, Mame Khan, Tawfiq Qureshi, and more.
So Jordan Rudess is the front man of Dream Theater.
Right.
And so, so I had all these soundscapes in my mind. And Ustad Zakir Hussain was the beacon. He was somebody who spoke to so many musical genres. And interestingly enough, I didn't dare to ask him for his help straight up, because I thought that, he would feel that he was this, fool. He's just trying to pull off something really big. And so I reached out to all the musicians, not even expecting replies, but they all replied. I was surprised. The only person who took a while to reply was Bela Fleck, who is a multiple Grammy winner. And I've sort of doted on him for many years now. And it's interesting that I reached out to him and then I got a text from Ustadji saying, he just wrote that one line saying, what can I tell Bela about your album?
Right.
So then he became the guiding force. I took, I got a lot of guidance from him about how I could go about doing this. For me, the vision was to create music that spoke to everyone. If you listen to the album, there's a vinyl of it out also now.
Love it.
We've created a vinyl and we submitted for the Grammys also. Unfortunately, we didn't get a nomination. And that's another thing, is that even in that platform, in the Recording Academy, I feel like a whole lot of genres are packaged into one genre, which is called global music, which was called world music. And now all the ethnic musical people have scored this big victory by calling it global music. But that hasn't changed anything about the fact that it's one tiny platform,
right,
which features everything from Afro-Cuban to, in contrast, there's a whole Latin Grammys for Latin music.
Yeah.
So I feel that's another thing we need to look at. We need to, it's really not the fault of the Academy, it's our fault.
Right.
We need to have a bigger voice in the world.
Right.
And I wanted to achieve this in my own small way. We tried to have this album. We were lucky that we could get all these legends together on one album just to make it a very unique musical experience. I would ask anybody to just listen to the album on merit and see if it talks to you, because it had elements. We had somebody like a Shankar Mahadevan who's been a mentor for me for many years now, and he agreed to sing 2 of the songs. So it was very commercial, very pulsating, but at the same time, and Zakir Bhai has been a guru, a mentor, a guiding force, as I said. He showed the way. But then we also had people like Javed Ali singing. So I went genre by genre. We had 6 or 7 songs. We had one Sufi, one Carnatic, one Thumri, so on and so forth, to give listeners a bouquet of Indian music, as it were.
Love it. And are you planning to bring it back again? Is that something that you're looking at doing over and over? Because it's worth doing. And then there's such an ensemble of artists on round one. I'm pretty sure the moment you put it out, you must have been thinking of future collaborations as well.
I did, and I will do it the instant I win the lottery. or if somebody listens to this podcast who is from a label which says, I'll put my faith in you, just like Sufi Score did back then. So yes, it would be a shame not to carry it forward, and I would love to. In fact, I have compositions ready, which I'm working on it in my spare time, keeping it as a sort of while I work on other albums. I'm right now working on a trance album, which is part of my efforts. Yeah, because I was, for a while, I realized that a lot. I went to Goa recently for a trip, and I saw that a lot of these foreigners who come to our shores through Goa, they come to these trance parties. But the trance music has elements of Indian music.
Sure.
And that's why they enjoy being in Goa with the whole Indian. So there's a bit of both worlds, in it. And so I'm trying to make this album, which is very, you can move to the music. It's trance music, and yet it's got the intellectual and melodic complexity of Indian music.
Right.
So let's see if I can get it right. We'll see.
Right. I love it. Takes me back. My reference point, and in my very limited sort of worldview, my reference point is always the late great Charanjit Singh with 10 ragas to a disco beat, and and the fact that translated so beautifully and timelessly, right? That is, I think, known as the first acid house album. It's hard. Don't ask me to describe what acid house means. This is a family-friendly podcast. But yeah, I'm so glad that you're exploring that side of things. Let me ask you this to just round this off. Outside of the world of what is your world of classical music or Shastriya Sangeet, what kind of music do you like?
Well, if you go through my playlist, if you go through my Spotify playlist, you will see all kinds of stuff. But there is a great deal of bias towards improvised forms of music. To me, nothing appeals like improvised forms of music. So other than our Indian forms of music, which is classical and folk, jazz music has a big role to play in that that department, because I feel jazz music is one of the most evolved forms of him, because in addition to the two axes, melody and rhythm, it has a third axis, which is harmony.
Right.
And the harmonic complexity of jazz is just mind-boggling for me. So there's a lot of jazz in there. Now, off late, there is a lot of sort of production-based, call it modern jazz, call it jazz rock.
Sure.
There are all these people who are, there's this guy called Tennyson.
Right.
And he is predominantly a producer.
Right.
There's this guy called Aaron Parks, and he has this. I forget the name of his album. I know the name of my favorite song on it, but he's a producer. Okay, but his background is jazz.
Right.
But then his music is very. It's not live jazz. It's not performed jazz. But there's a lot of production in it. So I enjoy that also. I enjoy hip hop also. I've been listening to a lot of hip hop. And obviously for this album, a lot of trance music also, trying to figure out what are the elements that we can take and what are the things we need to stay away from. So there's a lot of Bollywood. Believe me, when I say this, I try to keep myself up to date. And every time there is a song which touches my heart, I feel so proud, because there's this song, O Rangrez.
Right.
And Shankar Ehsaan Loy composed it so beautifully. And we had this discussion with Shankarji, and he asked me, what raga do you think this is? And it's actually very interestingly a raga called Nat Malhar, which is not a very popular, Gaud Malhar people know.
Sure.
And it is a bit of Gaud Malhar and a bit of Nat Malhar. Of course, it's a film song, so they have the liberty of. So every time there's a song like that which really appeals to me, I love it. There's a little bit of all of that.
Fantastic.
On my playlists.
Fantastic. I have one more question before I let you go. For someone who's never heard Indian classical music and always, has been exposed to maybe mainstream stuff or stuff that plays on TV or wherever else that kids get their music these days, can you give me one album that you would give that person as an introduction to Indian classical? And
when you say one album, you talk about a classical music album?
It could be something that you think would be a great entry point for someone who's never heard.
Well, if you want somebody to get into Indian classical music, I would definitely recommend The Call of the Valley, which has got Pandit Hariprasad Chaurasia, Pandit Shiv Kumar Sharma, and Pandit Brij Bhushan Kabra, and it beautifully encapsulates both folk and classical music.
Right.
You can just listen to it because it is so pleasant. It's like flowing water.
Right.
You can just put it on. And if you want it to create just a great ambience, you can do that. And if you want to listen to it with a lot of attention and understand every complexity, every improvised turn, then you can do that. So that's a great entry point. Shakti for sure, which is so contemporary at all levels throughout so many generations, and yet it is essentially based on Carnatic music.
Right.
And now with Shankar ji being a part of the band, there's that vocal element also. So there are some vocal compositions, beautifully written compositions, which are surfacing. So yeah, I would say these two albums would be a great starting point.
Fantastic. Purbayan, this was awesome. Thank you so much for making
Pleasure
the
is
time.
all mine. Thank you for having me on this podcast, and I look forward to listening to it myself, because I might have spoken some crap, which is
not at all. Not from where I'm listening. This was a great episode. I usually plan the episodes out a little bit, but very early in this conversation, we hit upon very rich vein of discussion, which I think is very merited. It was educational for me because, like I said, I've never had this kind of conversation with someone on the show. I feel like for me, and I'm not making this up, I've spent the last couple of weeks trying to put together something in the Indian instrumental space for my day job. So this comes at a very, very right time and very inspirational.
And it's sorry if the improvisational musician in me was steering the conversation into all sorts of directions.
Oh, no. Please don't do that Indian classical music stage thing where you're saying sorry about. Humility is nice and all that. Fantastic episode. I hope you enjoy listening to this. Thank you so much once again, Purbayan, for being on the show. Thank you to the team at IVM who helps put this show together. Thank you for keeping the temperature in the studio at a variable degree today. If you like this episode, what are you going to do? You're going to go to your kitchen. You're going to take a delicious, delicious dish of food from your fridge. You're going to put it in your microwave. You're going to give it 30 seconds to turn around inside the microwave. As it turns around, in the 30 seconds of your life that you're about to spend waiting, you will like and share this episode. And you will rate this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That's exactly what you're going to do if you like this episode. That's it from me. This is Vineet Kanabar saying goodbye.